All right, I'll begin the story now and give you the first chapter. At full length, as per the rules. The year was 1959, a year when the Cold War stretched its influence from Berlin to the deepest reaches of the Arctic and Antarctic. Across the world's oceans, governments were sending ships south toward the last unclaimed frontiers on Earth, seeking not only scientific knowledge but also symbolic dominance. The Soviet Union, having scored prestige with its early space achievements, was determined not to cede Antarctica to the Americans and British. And so, in a quiet announcement buried within state newspapers, the Academy of Sciences declared the deployment of a new Antarctic drift station, Polar Station P3. In truth, this was no ordinary base. Unlike traditional outposts built firmly on continental rock, P3 was to be established hundreds of kilometers inland, but not on stable land at all. Instead, the Soviets chose a massive ancient ice shelf that reached far into a frozen bay. Its surface flat enough for temporary camps, yet unstable enough that no Western power had dared to use it for permanent living. The Soviet reasoning was simple. A drift station would act as both a mobile observation platform and, potentially, a strategic outpost. By recording atmospheric and oceanographic data while the shelf slowly moved, they could collect information crucial for navigation, military planning, and global weather prediction. But the real, unspoken advantage was territorial symbolism, a message that Soviet endurance would go further than anyone else's. The men selected for P3 were a blend of hardened veterans from previous polar missions and bright young scientists eager to prove themselves. Leading the crew was Captain Yuri Mikhailovich Sokolov, a stoic naval officer who had once served on icebreakers resupplying Arctic stations. He was joined by meteorologist Nina Petrova, one of the few women in the Soviet Antarctic program at the time whose precision in readings was said to outmatch any mechanical instrument. The rest of the crew included glaciologist Pavel Rudik, radio engineer Viktor Leonov, mechanic Alexei Kravchenko, and medic Dr. Ivan Baranov. They numbered only 6, but each had been drilled for this near-impossible posting. 9 months of isolation in temperatures reaching minus 60 degrees Celsius, with resupply flights uncertain at best. Their journey began in January aboard the icebreaker OB, its red hull biting through thick pack ice under the dim summer sun. In their downtime, the crew of P3 studied technical blueprints, memorizing emergency protocols for pressure ridges, crevasse collapses, and katabatic wind events. Every man and woman aboard sensed the enormity of what they were attempting, yet optimism prevailed. After all, Soviet polar stations in the Arctic had successfully drifted for months before, and the Antarctic version was simply seen as a more adventurous challenge. When the OB reached the designated section of the Lazarev ice shelf, teams worked tirelessly to unload prefabricated huts, fuel drums, and scientific equipment onto the blinding white expanse. Within days, P3 appeared like a small village of metal and wood boxes linked by snow-packed paths. Radio masts reached skyward, their cables humming in the wind, while the meteorological tower bristled with sensors. The flag of the Soviet Union, bright red against the white void, snapped sharply under the constant gusts. To onlookers from afar, the setup must have seemed solid, permanent even. But the crew knew the truth. Beneath them lay an unfathomable thickness of ancient ice, and beyond that, a hidden ocean. The entire platform was destined eventually to break apart. Still, morale in those first weeks was high. Daily routines were strict. 06 wake up, communal breakfast of black bread and condensed milk, then assignments for the day. Meteorological readings were taken hourly. Ice core samples were drilled and labeled. Radio contact with Moscow was routine, sometimes carrying news from home or updates on international Antarctic events. In the evenings, with the wind beginning to howl outside, they played chess or read from the small shared library. The slow Antarctic twilight painted the snow in impossible colors, purples and blues fading into black. "It feels," Nina Petrova remarked one night, "like we are standing on the roof of the earth." And yet, even in those early days, there were signs. The wind was stronger than predicted. an almost constant roar that rattled the station's walls and kept fine snow in endless motion. The temperatures, too, were dipping lower than forecasts had suggested for the season. Captain Sokolov, while outwardly calm, made mental notes of ice cracks he spotted during his walks from hut to hut. Some of the fissures were new, the edges clean and sharp, and they seemed to widen after storms. But Moscow had given clear instructions: remain in position and gather at least 3 months of initial drift data before making any recommendations on evacuation or relocation. The crew kept working, driven by both duty and the strange allure of a place so empty it felt untouched since the planet's birth. They laughed at minor accidents, like when a gust tore Leonov's fur hat clean off his head and sent it tumbling into an unrecoverable crevasse. They celebrated small victories, like successfully repairing the diesel generator after it froze, using nothing but warmed tools and persistence. But under the surface, the continent was already speaking to them in its own language. Groans of shifting ice, percussive rumbles from far-off breaks, eerie vibrations that traveled through their boots at night. None of them could have guessed how soon those noises would grow louder. None of them yet understood that the ice shelf they called home was beginning to move in ways that even the vast Soviet planning apparatus could not predict. And so, P3 settled into its first month on the drifting white desert, unaware that each passing day brought them closer to a point from which there would be no return. Shall I write the next chapter? The wind outside was no longer merely a backdrop. It had become a living presence, with moods that shifted violently and without warning. Days could begin in ghostly stillness and end in screaming gales that bent the metal antenna masts and scoured snow from the ice shelf in white, blinding plumes. The crew of P3 still followed their routines, but they worked in a tightening rhythm, speaking louder against the noise, moving more deliberately across the groaning surface. It was during one of these morning rounds in early February that Captain Sokolov noticed it. A hairline crack slicing across the snow trail between the main hut and the meteorological tower. It was narrow, no more than the width of his boot, but when he kicked away the snow cover, the ice beneath fell away sharply into darkness. In his log that evening he wrote, "Crevasse, forming rapidly near central path. Possibly related to upstream pressure or shelf movement, will monitor closely." It seemed minor enough at the time, but in Antarctica, such lines were like the first tilts of a sinking ship, the earliest visible signals of a far greater break. Within days, more fissures appeared. Some could be stepped across. Others demanded detours as they lengthened and deepened. Their edges were fresh, translucent blue, without the rounded erosion of old crevasses. Rudik, the glaciologist, examined them and warned that the shelf's internal stress was increasing. "The shelf is bending," he told Sokolov one evening over tea, "pulling away from the inner mass. If there's calving ahead, we'll be cut free." They informed Moscow, transmitting both weather readings and a cautious note about the ice instability. The reply, after a long delay crackling across thousands of kilometers of ionosphere, was typical of the era. "Continue operations. Observe. Do not alter plans until further directive." Scientific goals, it seemed, still outweighed survival probabilities, at least for those giving orders from Red Square. But the ice had its own agenda. Around mid-February, seismic tremors began to ripple through the station at irregular intervals. The instruments registered them, sharp, sudden jolts unlike the distant earthquakes sometimes detected from the southern ocean floor. One night, a boom echoed beneath their bunks, followed by a series of deep, rolling cracks that sounded almost like artillery. The crew gathered in silence, listening as the noises moved westward into the darkness. Power outages became frequent. The generator housing, lashed against the wind, filled with so much blown snow that Kravchenko had to shovel it clear every 2 hours. Fuel drums, stored in a shallow trench, were found half buried and beginning to freeze internally, threatening to clog their lines. They resorted to heating the diesel with improvised coils made from scavenged radio wire, a dangerous improvisation, but essential for keeping the machines running. Morale began to shift. Chess games were quieter, meals were shorter. Even the weather reports, once read aloud with an air of professional pride, were now noted down mechanically, as if the numbers were mocking them. -40, -50, wind chill readings beyond the charts. Stress accumulated like ice layers, invisible yet heavy. Then came the night the ice spoke with absolute clarity. A windstorm screamed across P3 for 30 continuous hours, battering the huts in a relentless assault. On the second morning, the crew emerged to find that a massive rift had opened less than 50 meters from the radio mast. It stretched as far as they could see in both directions, a black wound running through the white horizon. The crevasse was at least 30 meters wide, and they could hear the ice walls grinding against each other with the slow, catastrophic power of tectonic plates. Petrova's instruments told the rest of the story. Their coordinates had shifted almost half a kilometer toward the sea compared to the previous week. Structural separation had begun. The portion of the Lazarev shelf that carried P3 was starting to drift. They sent a priority message to Moscow. Station likely to be set adrift within days. Request immediate evacuation. For hours, the radio hissed with nothing but static. When a reply finally arrived, it was maddening in its ambiguity. Evacuation request received. Situation monitored. Continue operations until further notice. The crew gathered in the mess hut that night, the blizzard pressing against the thin metal walls. Sokolov spoke slowly, weighing each word. Comrades, until further notice, we operate as before, but make your preparations. If the shelf calves in full, we will have no land connection, and then we will be on our own. No one argued. They knew that unseen forces, both political and natural, were closing in from every direction. The Soviet command wanted their data. The continent wanted them off its back. Between the two, the shelf beneath their boots cracked a little deeper in the night. It would not be long before those lines opened into an abyss. Shall I write the next chapter? By the first week of March, the world beneath their feet shifted from being a foundation to a vessel, except this vessel had no helm, no engine, and no guarantee of staying in one piece. The day began with a deep, concussive roar somewhere far off to the north. The sound approached in waves, echoing through the frozen air like rolling thunder. Then came the vibration, a long, low hum that rattled cups and loosened frost from the hut ceilings. Sokolov threw on his parka and led the crew outside into a blinding glare of sunlight reflecting off freshly blasted snow. What they saw was not a sight any of them would ever forget. A fracture line had torn free along the horizon, an entire barrier of ice splitting, parting in a jagged, violent line that extended for kilometers. They watched as towering walls of ice tilted and fell into the sea, with booms so loud they punched in the chest. Some fragments were the size of office buildings, others the size of towns. And slowly, inexorably, they realized that the break had fully separated them from the continental side of the Lazarev shelf. The silence afterward was absolute, except for the faint, almost imperceptible creak and sway beneath their boots. Petrova radioed their new coordinates, and the readings confirmed their fear. They were on a drifting floe, approximately 22 by 13 kilometers in size, being slowly pulled seaward by the Antarctic coastal current. The largest continent on Earth had just set them afloat like a matchbox in an icy river. The immediate result was chaos. Moscow's messages, already erratic, became even more delayed. The communication path now bounced over unpredictable skip distances, with ionospheric conditions worsened by the polar aurora. When they did manage to get through, their reports were cut by bursts of static, replies coming hours later with contentless reassurances that a rescue plan was under study. Then disaster compounded disaster. 2 fuel drums ruptured when the ice beneath their storage trench suddenly collapsed into a hidden crevasse, swallowing the barrels whole. The diesel drenched the walls of the void, vanishing into the dark. A week's worth of remaining ration boxes went missing the following morning, swept away when the ice edge calved without warning during the night. The survivors woke to find the storage sled half hanging into the sea, its contents gone. Now the mission's original purpose truly died. Every hour shifted towards survival. Rudik and Kravchenko doubled patrols for cracks, carrying long poles to test the ice ahead. Petrova and Sokolov devoted themselves solely to weather and drift tracking. The only way to know whether they were drifting toward potential rescue lanes or toward the emptiest sectors of the Southern Ocean. And yet the psychological toll may have been the greater enemy. Isolation gnawed at them. Daylight itself was both friend and foe. With the sun still skimming the horizon, its light reflected off the drifting sea around them in a blinding haze that never allowed the body to feel true darkness or rest. Sleep came only in fractured bursts, haunted by the slow groaning roll of the floe and the recurrent fear that the next fracture could come directly under a hut. Then came the moment when they understood just how alone they had become. One dusk, Sokolov spotted a distant white plume on the horizon, spray from a possible ship's bow. The entire crew gathered on the ridge to watch, binoculars scanning. For an hour they tracked the motion, a dark smudge appearing intermittently through the glare. But as the object drew nearer, the outline resolved not into a vessel, but into a massive iceberg, turning slowly in a loose gyre around their drifting floe. The plume had been the crash of waves against its vertical face. In the silence that followed, Leonov muttered, "We could be 200 or 2,000 kilometers from land. And who would know the difference?" The drift quickened over the next 10 days. The continent behind them sank lower into haze. The Southern Ocean ahead was a moving cityscape of ice, bergy bits, growlers, tabular giants. Some nights the sound of collisions echoed across the floe, their new home grinding against other icebergs, shuddering underfoot. The vibrations were smooth sometimes, jolting at others, each time threatening to open a seam in the wrong place. By the end of March, all formal scientific work had ceased. They were burning fuel only for heat, limiting generator operation to urgent communication windows. Their clothes reeked faintly of the diesel smoke that now served as both warmth and cooking fuel. Baranov began extracting vitamins from the ship's medicine chest to slow the creeping weakness in their limbs. Each man and woman had lost weight. Then came a night when the wind fell away entirely, leaving only the knotted groan of the ice in motion. The air temperature plummeted. In the stillness they heard something strange. A hollow, resonant knocking from deep beneath them, patterned, almost rhythmic. It rose through the ice like drumbeats, then ceased. No one spoke of it, but each felt the same chill beyond the cold. This floe was a living platform now, and it was leading them somewhere they hadn't chosen, somewhere no one could predict. And in that moment, each silently accepted that they had crossed into a pure survival situation. The map in their heads had been ripped to pieces, but they all knew that survival meant more than waiting. Soon, a decision would have to be made, a break from Moscow's inaction, an irreversible step into the unknown. Shall I write the next chapter? The decision, when it came, was not made in a single dramatic moment, but in the slow accumulation of signs that waiting would mean death. By early April, the drift had carried them even farther north, into a region of more volatile sea ice. The floe that had seemed immense now felt smaller with each fracture. Pressure ridges, great frozen waves formed when sheets of ice collided, rose overnight like barricades, blocking the paths between their huts. A cache of supplies had to be abandoned when an entire section of their camp was isolated behind a jagged wall taller than a man and too dangerous to cross in the dark. Petrova's readings told them the flow speed was unpredictable. 2 days drifting sluggishly, then a surge of several kilometers in a single night. Once they woke to find open water only 100 meters beyond the northern edge. The sound of the waves lapping against ice was terrifying in its unfamiliarity. A sound that didn't belong in the Antarctic interior, but one that now marked their prison's slow disintegration. Moscow's messages, when they appeared at all, became impossibly vague. Hold position, relief mission in planning, estimated timeline pending. The relief could be months away. It could be never. Sokolov knew that the Soviet command would hesitate to dispatch any vessel far into these unpredictable waters at the height of Antarctic winter. These were political waters, as much as they were geographic. Sending an icebreaker into a dangerous sea for 6 people was not likely to be a Kremlin priority when there was no foreign audience to impress. It was Kravchenko, the mechanic, who first said aloud what the others had only thought. "We should move before this thing breaks apart beneath us. Take the sledges, what food we have left, and get to the nearest supply depot." Rudik shook his head. The depot was more than 1,000 kilometers away, across shifting sea ice and open leads of water. But Kravchenko countered, "If we wait, we will be swimming in the Southern Ocean or starving on a piece of ice too small to land a plane on." The discussion simmered for days. The only alternative to evacuation under their own power was to attempt to signal any ship in the vicinity, but there was no guarantee any would pass close enough to see them. And even if one did, crossing the ice and water labyrinth to reach it would still be necessary. On the night of April 12th, the decision was forced. A thunderous crack jolted them awake, louder than anything before. Outside, in the light of their headlamps, they watched in disbelief as a massive central fracture zigzagged directly through the camp. It missed the main hut and generator by less than 10 meters. Their home was now split by a widening gap of black seawater. Sokolov called them all inside. His face was pale, but his voice was level. "We prepare for departure. We take the 2 motor sledges, all remaining food, fuel, and the inflatable boat. We will travel toward the Franklin depot. We move in 2 days." 2 days was all they had to gather everything essential. The sledges were stripped of all non-critical cargo. Left behind were all scientific instruments, almost all books, even personal possessions. They packed fuel cans, ration tins, a field radio, survival clothing, tent canvas, tools, and the boat, which they lashed onto one sledge. It was designed for short crossings over open leads in summer, not for this labyrinth of ice and frigid water in early winter, but it was their only means to bridge gaps in the ice. Departure morning dawned sharp and windless, the kind of deceptive calm the Antarctic sometimes gave before unleashing chaos. They left behind the huts and mast, the red flag limp in the air. No one spoke much as they loaded up and checked the engines of the sledges, knowing that each kilometer forward took them deeper into risk, but nearer to the slimmest chance of survival. Their route would take them first across the rough pressure zones where ice floes collided. The roaring of those collisions could be heard long before they reached them, the crack and groan of a moving, grinding world. Each time they approached a lead of water, they stopped, pulled out the inflatable, and ferried gear across. It was brutal, freezing work. Land, unload, drag, reload, all while the air temperature plunged and their breath turned to crystals in their eyelashes. The floes groaned underfoot as if reluctant to let them pass. At night, they huddled around a small stove inside their tent with the inky darkness pressing in and the knowledge that they were far beyond any direct line to safety. But the forward motion gave them something they had lacked for weeks: agency. This was their plan now, their own survival. Still, everyone knew that the next stage of the journey would be worse. Past the shifting jigsaw of the near drift lay heavier, broken pack ice swept by storms with open channels too wide to bridge quickly. Beyond those, the long, featureless plains of wind-blasted ice guarded the way to the depot. And somewhere out there, between them, and even the faint hope of rescue, waited the sharpest edge of the Antarctic's cruelty. Shall I write the next chapter? The first week of travel was an unending clash between human endurance and the chaotic architecture of the sea ice. The motor sledges, though sturdy by design, were never meant for this kind of terrain. Jagged, angular slabs of ice pressed vertically into ridges twice their height by the immense hydraulic forces of colliding floes. These pressure ridges became walls in their path, forcing detours that added hours or even days to the route. They learned quickly that progress was measured not in kilometers, but in meters won after back-breaking effort. The engines strained at low gear, and when even that failed, the crew resorted to man-hauling, tying themselves to sledges and dragging them over irregular terrain, step by punishing step, their crampons scraping ice. The cargo they had so carefully chosen felt like a cruel weight, but every item was crucial. There was nothing they could discard without risking death. Each night, Sokolov plotted their slow coordinates on a damp and weather-worn map. They were heading toward the great arc of coastal barrier that shielded the Franklin Depot, but the drift of surrounding ice and constant navigation around impassable zones meant their line was more of a chaotic zigzag than a straight run. The weather was growing worse by the day. The winds, absent when they began, returned in icy gales that seemed to pierce through every seam of their clothing. Gusts flung powdered ice into their faces like sandblasts, scouring skin raw and reducing visibility to meters. More than once they set up the tent in whiteout conditions, huddling inside for entire days while the Antarctic screamed around them. It was on the 12th night that the first true disaster struck. Kravchenko had parked one of the sledges near what seemed a solid snowfield. While the others pitched camp, he went back with a small spade to dig out an anchor line. That's when the snow beneath him gave way. Without warning, the surface caved in. A hidden lead of water lay beneath a thin crust. Kravchenko plunged in up to his waist, icy seawater soaking his trousers and boots in seconds. Baranov and Sokolov dragged him out, their gloves freezing instantly into hard shells from the splashes. They stripped Kravchenko inside the tent, rubbing his legs with cloths while Petrova boiled water for tea. Hypothermia sets in almost instantly in those conditions, and for hours they monitored him, forcing hot drinks into him as he trembled violently. By morning he was past the worst danger, but his feet were dangerously pale. Baranov warned that frostbite was inevitable if they didn't protect him perfectly in the days ahead. It was a sobering lesson. The ice could kill not just through storms and starvation, but in sudden, silent collapses beneath their boots. The strain began to show in faces and tempers. Leonov, the radio man, kept his equipment packed deep to shield it from damage. Each evening, with the tent floor shuddering under wind gusts, he would try to raise some signal, any signal, on the battered set. Mostly it was static. Once or twice, faint Morse fragments broke through the noise, never clear enough to confirm a location. The long silences afterward only deepened the haunting sense of being beyond all reach. By the third week, their fuel supply was dangerously low. They rationed engine use, running the sledges only in short bursts and sometimes moving them only with human power to save the diesel for later stages. This slowed their pace even more. The depot seemed as far away as the day they had started. But turning back was impossible. Behind them, the floe they'd left had likely splintered into dozens of smaller, unrecognizable fragments. Then, one evening, just as the low sun burned a dull orange on the horizon, they climbed a pressure ridge and saw something that froze them in place. Beyond the uneven field of ice lay an open channel of water at least several hundred meters wide. On the far side, flat pack ice stretched toward the direction of the depot, gleaming gold in the fading light. It was both a promise and a threat. The channel, a yawning gap the inflatable boat could barely cross in calm conditions, was roiled by moving floes, jostling and grinding in a steady current. If they attempted the crossing, without the right lull, the ice could crush the boat against the floe edge. If they waited too long, shifting winds could expand the gap beyond the boat's range entirely. Sokolov stared in silence before finally speaking. "If we cannot cross here, there will be no depot, no rescue." They set camp at the ridge edge, watching the dark water roll and break against the ice, knowing that this channel would become the deciding gate of their desperate journey. And somewhere deep inside, each of them realized that the crossing ahead would demand everything they had left, and that failure here would mean the end. Shall I write the next chapter? They began preparing before the first hint of sun touched the ice. The channel ahead was still veiled in the pale pre-dawn light, black water bordered by jagged lips of white, swirling with fragments of broken floe. The current moved deceptively slow on the surface, but beneath, you could hear the deep, steady grinding of ice rubbing against ice. Sokolov called them together inside the tent for one last briefing. The inflatable boat was their only bridge. It would take 3 trips to ferry all 6 of them and the cargo across, with the motor sledges dismantled into manageable pieces. Timing and discipline would dictate success or disaster. "When we go," Sokolov said, "we do not stop. We do not turn back unless I order it. And we speak little. Words waste breath and distract." Baranov, ever the doctor, double-checked everyone's clothing layers, tightening mittens and ensuring no skin would be exposed during the crossing. Kravchenko, still nursing frostbitten toes, insisted on taking the first trip, determined not to be the one left behind if anything went wrong. They slid the boat down a narrow tongue of ice to the water, its rubbery skin creaking in the cold. Leonov and Rudik took the paddles. The little outboard motor, too precious in fuel, would be used only if the current fought them harder than expected. Sokolov went in the first load with Kravchenko and Petrova. The rest knelt, holding the stern in place as the swell lifted and nudged it toward the cold nothing beyond the edge. Then, with a heave, they were off. The channel was wider than it had looked from the ridge. 10 meters out, the floes around them shifted, tilting like the pieces of a puzzle whose picture had been thrown into motion. Leonov, standing on the far bank to watch, saw one slab roll and vanish, a reminder of how unstable even the solid edges were. Each paddle stroke seemed to carry the boat both forward and sideways with the current's pull, forcing Rudik to angle his strokes harder. When Sokolov's group reached the opposite side, there was no luxury in pausing. They hauled the boat onto a shaky ice edge, 2 of them clinging to a pressure knob for balance, while Petrova kept the gear from sliding back into the water. The return trip for the second load was even harder. The current had picked up, peppering the boat with smaller ice chunks that had to be pushed away before they could puncture the skin. By the time the final trip came, with Leonov and Baranov as passengers, the water was choppier still. Dark swells lifted the bow and dropped it into deep troughs. Halfway across, a slab the size of a car suddenly surged upward a few meters away. It tilted toward them like a slow, inevitable blade. Sokolov, who'd taken the bow oar for the return, barked at Rudik to pull hard starboard. The slab slid past just meters away, its pale underwater bulk vanishing into the blackness ahead. When they finally reached the far side and dragged the boat above the tide crack, they lay sprawled on the ice, panting clouds of steam into the frigid air. No one spoke for several minutes. The crossing had cost them most of the morning, but in its own way it had lifted a weight. Now they were on the same great plate of pack ice as the distant depot. The landmass they sought was still hundreds of kilometers southeast, but they were no longer trapped on the drifting floe that had carried them hopelessly toward oblivion. For a time, the going was easier. The sledges, reassembled, hummed forward across flatter ice, and there were stretches where the snow was compact enough to allow for bursts of real speed. They laughed once, all of them, when Petrova spotted a line of penguins in the far distance, a strange reminder of life in a place that had seemed wholly dead for weeks. But the reprieve was short-lived. 3 days later, a storm began to form on the horizon, a slow, monstrous wall of black cloud. The air pressure collapsed so fast their ears popped. In the hour before it struck, the wind shifted wildly, blowing first from the east, then the west, and finally in an icy torrent from the south. Baranov muttered that these were katabatic winds, the unstoppable gravity-fueled air rolling down from the polar plateau, capable of crushing a man against the ice like an unseen hand. When the storm hit, it erased the world. White swallowed everything. They pitched the tent in almost zero visibility, the fabric snapping and clawing at its anchoring lines. The sleet hit like stone dust, lodging in every fold of clothing, melting and freezing again. For 2 straight days, they were trapped inside that tiny fabric shell, buried under drifting snow, listening to the Antarctic tear at their walls. When the winds eased at last, a new horror awaited. One of the sledges was gone, simply vanished in the storm. Its anchor lines had snapped, and it had been driven away into the empty distance. Along with it went 1/3 of their food. They were now on a clock measured not in days, but in meals, and the depot was still a journey of unknown length over ice that could yet turn against them at any hour. Somewhere out ahead, in that broken silence, lay both salvation and the final measure of their strength. And there would be no turning back. Shall I write the next chapter? They broke camp in grim silence the morning after the storm's devastation. The shock of losing one sledge had settled into a heavy, unspoken knowledge. They could no longer afford errors, detours, or delays. Even with perfect luck, their food would run out before they reached the Franklin depot. Without perfect luck, there would be frostbitten fingers clawing at empty ration tins. From this point forward, every member of the team carried part of the load in their own packs to ease the strain on the single remaining sledge. It slowed their pace, but ensured the sled's runners wouldn't sink or stick as badly in soft patches. At each rest stop, Baranov rationed out exact portions of dried fish, hard biscuits, and condensed milk, no more than a few bites per person. The gnawing hunger stalked them now, making the days longer, eyes fixed on a horizon that still refused to deliver sight of the depot's marker flags. The terrain began to rise subtly beneath their boots, leading them up into a network of crevasses that hadn't been on Rudik's hand-drawn route sketch. Some were narrow enough to step across with care. Others yawned meters wide, their depth swallowing the beam from their headlamps into infinite blue. Roped travel became constant. One at a time, they would cross each gap. The others braced against ice axes or anchor screws drilled into the crust. On the 4th day after the storm, disaster came again, this time in near silence. Leonov was third in line, crossing a thin snow bridge over a crevasse when the surface beneath him dropped. He fell in up to his armpits before the rope caught him, his boots kicking empty air over a void wide enough to swallow the main hut they'd left behind weeks ago. The others hauled him out, his face pale and eyes wide, the rope leaving bruises across his chest. They said nothing as they moved on. Words were becoming useless currency. Only movement mattered. At night, the hunger was at its most unbearable. Sleep brought dreams saturated with food, steaming bowls of borscht, bread thick with butter, the crunch of fresh apples. Dreams that banished the ice for fleeting minutes before waking into a world where nothing existed but the hiss of the stove, the stink of diesel, and the vast, indifferent stars overhead. Petrova began coughing deep in her chest, her cheeks too pale against the darkness of her hair. Baranov brewed willow herb tea from leaves he'd kept in his medical pack as a last comfort, but they all knew it was warmth, not medicine. Then, on the 7th morning of this grim march, they saw something on the horizon. At first it appeared to be another pressure ridge, a jagged white rise against the otherwise monotonous expanse. But as the sun shifted, dark vertical lines became visible, the weather-beaten poles of marker flags. It took them the rest of the day to reach those markers, the depot rising slowly from the ice like a mirage. A series of half-buried storage huts lay in a staggered row, drifted over but still intact. The smell of old fuel hung in the air. The Franklin depot was here. They had reached it. Inside the first hut, they found fuel drums, crates of dry rations, and medical stores. Much of it was frost-hardened and several years old, but still perfectly edible. Baranov insisted they eat slowly, afraid that gorging after weeks of starvation could make them violently ill. Even holding back, the shock of food in their stomachs brought them to tears they didn't hide. There was also a hand-cranked radio, older than Leonov's field set but larger, more powerful, and with an antenna system buried in the snow nearby. Clearing that mast and getting it upright became their first real mission in weeks that didn't involve moving forward. When Leonov cranked up the device that evening, the warmth of the hut around them, he began sending a steady series of Mayday calls. Hours passed with nothing but static. Then, just before midnight, a voice cracked through. Faint, distorted, but human. The call sign identified it as a vessel, location unknown. Leonov repeated their coordinates 3 times, voice shaking. There was a pause, then the reply, "Message received. Will attempt approach. Heavy ice." And then silence. They didn't know who the ship belonged to. They didn't know how far it was. All they knew was that someone out there had heard them. The depot had bought them time, but whether that time would end in salvation or in silence would depend on what came over the horizon next, and whether the ice would let it through. Shall I write the next chapter? The next 3 days at Franklin Depot were a strange, tense limbo. The crew was no longer in immediate starvation, but the depot's thin wooden walls and frost-laden windows were no fortress against the Antarctic. Every gust rattled the structure, every groan of the ice beneath reminded them that they had not truly escaped danger. They had merely paused long enough to catch their breath. The rations they found gave them some relief. Tins of meat and fish, sealed bricks of rye bread, and hard sugar lumps that seemed almost too precious to eat. But fuel remained scarce. The depot's few remaining drums were enough to heat the hut and power equipment for perhaps 2 weeks at most. If no ship arrived by then, they would be forced once again to choose between sitting and slowly freezing, or striking out into the ice toward God knew what. Outside, the weather worsened. Thick, low clouds cast a permanent twilight over the depot, and fine snow drifted endlessly across the flat expanse, erasing their tracks within minutes. Each day, Leonov worked the depot's old radio, sending out distress calls in Russian and English, repeating their coordinates with robotic precision. Expedition P3, 6 survivors, requesting rescue, ice conditions heavy. Most of the time, he received only static in reply. It was on the morning of the 4th day that a sound cut through the wind. A faint, deep horn over the horizon. Everyone froze. Sokolov's eyes narrowed. Ships sometimes used horns in heavy ice for navigation, but there was no guarantee it was meant for them. They scrambled up the nearest wind-scoured ice rise, scanning the distance. At first they saw nothing, only the vague turbulence of fog over the pack ice. Then, a dark shape began to materialize. A vessel's bow, pushing through pressure ridges, flanked by towering white walls of ice. It was not a Soviet icebreaker. Through the binoculars, Sokolov could make out the faded blue and white hull markings of a ship he did not recognize, its deck piled with equipment. The flag snapping from its mast was red, white, and blue, but horizontal stripes, not vertical. A Dutch flag. Petrova whispered, "The Koningin Maria, a research vessel. I read of her in the Antarctic dispatches last year." The crew of P3 rushed to prepare a signal. Using torn sections of the hut's canvas roof, they laid out the largest possible red cross against the snow, hoping the vessel's crew would spot it from their bridge or crow's nest. Hours later, the ship had closed the distance enough that its engines, laboring through the ice, became a constant throbbing presence. Finally, over the radio, Leonov caught the voice they had been waiting for. "This is the Koningin Maria. We have your signal. Stand by for approach." Relief came with an edge of deep uncertainty. Sokolov knew that contact with a foreign vessel was politically sensitive, especially in the tense climate of 1959. The Soviet Union had no official cooperative agreement with the Netherlands in Antarctic waters, and his crew carried weeks' worth of raw scientific data, some of it potentially useful for navigation and military forecasts. Would Moscow see their rescue as a triumph, or as a failure that required careful rewriting? By mid-afternoon, the Koningin Maria was near enough for its small motor launch to crunch through the last stretch of ice to the depot. The Dutch crew, wrapped in thick oilskins, their breath steaming in the cold, greeted the 6 ragged Soviet survivors with handshakes and stunned expressions. Their captain, a broad-shouldered man named Van der Meer, looked them up and down and said simply, "You are far from home." They ferried the Soviets to the ship in 2 trips. The moment Sokolov stepped onto her deck, the wind seemed to lose its bite, replaced by the acrid scent of diesel and the almost alien sound of footsteps on metal instead of snow. Inside, the warmth was overwhelming. Their cold-numbed limbs prickled painfully as blood returned. The Dutch crew offered blankets, strong coffee, and food that tasted impossibly fresh. That night, In the captain's mess, Sokolov sat with Vandermeer to explain their story, though he was careful with certain details. He spoke of the drift, the collapse of their station, the long trek to the depot. He avoided any mention of precise survey areas or the type of readings taken at P3. Vandermeer listened without pressing, though Sokolov could tell by the flickers in his eyes that he understood there was more to the tale. The Koningin Maria turned north for her planned route back toward South Africa, carrying the 6 Soviets with her. The ice slowly thinned around them. The horizon to the south became a pale memory. But as the days passed, an unspoken question hung in the mess. What would happen when they finally stepped back onto a Soviet-controlled dock, brought there not by their own vessels, but by the goodwill of foreigners? None of them yet knew that their miraculous rescue would be buried under silence, that their families would be given only fragments of the truth, and that the name of P3 would vanish almost entirely from public Soviet memory. For the moment, they felt only the shifting roll of the deck beneath their chairs, and a faint disbelief that they would live to see spring again. But the ice and the journey it had forced upon them would never let them go entirely. Shall I write the final chapter? They disembarked in the port of Murmansk weeks later, stepping onto the quay in clothes still stiff with Antarctic frost and stained diesel. The reception was muted, almost clinical. A knot of Soviet naval officers, a few men from the Academy of Sciences, and a photographer from Pravda. Smiles were painted on, handshake angles rehearsed. The photographer took several shots of the 6 thin, faced survivors alongside Captain Sokolov, but the Dutch officers who had walked them down the gangway were politely steered out of the frame. In the official debriefing room, the cold returned, not from weather, but from the tone of their interrogators. They were questioned for hours repeatedly about every stage of their drift, every instrument recovered or lost, every page of meteorological readings. The emphasis was clear. The mission's scientific results took precedence over descriptions of hardship or courage. In statements eventually released to the press, the rescue was presented as an arranged transfer from a friendly vessel in neutral waters, and the Dutch connection was left deliberately vague. Petrova's health had deteriorated from the long exposure and coughing fits. She was sent to a hospital in Leningrad, where her discharge papers listed complications from influenza, rather than frostbite scars across her fingertips. Leonov was reassigned to a closed radio laboratory in Arkhangelsk, his role in the final rescue receiving only a passing mention in an internal commendation. Rudik's request to return to Antarctic work was quietly denied, though no official reason was given. Sokolov, summoned to Moscow, presented the expedition's raw data to the Academy. What could be salvaged from the drifting months proved surprisingly valuable. Rare seismic records from beneath the Lazarev Shelf, extended observations of katabatic wind patterns, and detailed notes on ice carving events in an area few other nations had mapped. The findings were incorporated into Soviet Antarctic research archives, but without his name or the words P3 attached. To the public, the expedition simply faded away. The Soviet Antarctic program continued, building new stations farther inland or on more stable ice grounded to the continent's bedrock. By the mid-1960s, Polar Station P3 existed more as an unspoken cautionary tale for planners than as a feat of survival. Decades passed. The Cold War ended. The archives began to open, slowly, selectively. In 2004, a researcher at the Russian State Archive of the Navy came across a retransmission record of P3's last weeks of messages. For the first time in 45 years, the documented coordinates of the station's drift path were plotted onto modern maps. When overlaid with satellite imagery, the path matched the natural currents feeding into the Weddell Gyre, confirming that the flow-carrying P3 had indeed been on a trajectory toward eventual breakup deep in the Southern Ocean. Without the trek to Franklin Depot, and without the Koningin Maria's appearance in those waters that month, none of them would have lived beyond early winter. That same year, a Dutch maritime museum in Rotterdam mounted an exhibition on their nation's polar history. At the edge of a hall filled with model ships and oilskins was a single glass case, a faded Soviet fur hat, a chipped enamel mug, and a handwritten letter of thanks in Russian addressed to Captain Vandermeer, dated June 1959. No photograph accompanied it, and the exhibit label simply read, "Gift from unidentified Soviet survivors rescued in Antarctic waters." Today, the name P3 remains largely absent from mainstream histories of Antarctic exploration. Yet among polar researchers, whispers endure about the Soviet drift station that got away, a phrase that carries both the echo of calamity survived and the shadow of truths withheld. In the end, P3's crew carried their ordeal in memory alone, each marked by it in ways visible only to those who had also faced the white void. They had gone south to measure the ice in months and in meters. What they found instead was the measure of themselves. And in that brutal, drifting world, it had been enough to keep them alive.